All right. So, really excited to kick off this inaugural identity experts conversation with you both. Today's chat is going to be with David Mattei from Aite-Novarica and Chris Briggs from Mitek. So, I guess, gentlemen, let's start with a round of introductions. David, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate it. Again, my name is David Mattei. I am strategic advisor at Aite-Novarica Group, and been here for about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I spent 16 years in the payment processing world, managing card fraud for about 1,400 institutions and about 250,000 merchants.
Wow. And Chris?
Fantastic. I feel overshadowed, but thank you, Adam and David, for joining. So I've been about 25 years in the industry, mostly around technology, fraud, and identity. Various consulting firms, worked with a couple of the bureaus, most recently with a decentralized identity company called Fireside that does a ton of great stuff with government and the travel space, which is a very interesting growth space in general for the industry overall.
Fantastic. So let's dive right in. I'm actually going to start with you, David. I know you were the author of a recent Aite matrix on global document identification and verification. Given the extensive research that you obviously had to do in our space, I'd love to just start by kind of asking you to describe kind of the current state of the IDV market.
Yeah, I would say the market is really strong right now. And not only that, but it's growing and expanding all the time. We did a study similar to this back in 2018. And at that time, when we canvassed the industry to see the number of commercial solutions that are out there, we found about not quite 20. And last year, when we refreshed the report and we were looking again, the number was closer to 50. And so just in a very short period of time, the number of people, the number of companies who are offering solutions in the space has really grown quite a bit. But it's not a tool just for financial services anymore. It's really beyond that. There's many other industries that are starting to pick up this technology and use it. The other thing that we found is that the technical breadth of these solutions has greatly expanded. It used to be just, okay, here's your selfie and here's my driver's license. Now go match the two pictures. Man, the technology has moved way beyond just that. There's a lot of new capabilities that are being built into them. And, it's beyond just fraud. I mean, we're finding that not only is it doing fraud and handling fraud cases, but also getting into use cases in the area of compliance and KYC as well.
Yeah, absolutely true. And, I think along those same lines, I'm kind of curious, were there any specific market drivers? Because you had mentioned, differing use cases, but, we see different client requirements, we see different market drivers. I'm kind of wondering if you saw any that sort of started to come up more frequently in your research.
Yeah, there was a couple of market drivers that we saw that stood out from everything else. One being just the acceleration of any and all things digital. Whether that be opening up a new account online, applying for a credit card. Fraudsters love the anonymity of the digital channel. They're able to hide behind the fact that they can be faceless, and they don't have to actually present themselves to security cameras or a person or anything else along those lines. And so what they're doing is that the fraudsters are attacking those companies that didn't have lax digital authentication controls. And the other thing that we're finding out there is that just the amount of personally identifiable information that has been stolen through data breaches over the years, the fraudsters have been very good at being able to take that data and using it to impersonate people. So, and that's also spilling over into the area of synthetic identity fraud as well.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of that same sentiment around, you mentioned synthetic identities, but we've even seen it in sort of the authentication space, as you alluded to earlier, of the idea that you've got a password that's out there that hasn't been breached somewhere, or an email address that isn't on somebody's list, or those types of things. Like, all of that information is out there somewhere at this point. So it's really, some of those legacy authentication methods just are not secure in the current day and age.
Yep.
So Chris, I'll ask you. We were sort of talking about some new and emerging use cases that David heard about. I'm kind of wondering, have you seen additional trends or even similar trends, from the customers that you focus on when you're thinking about product development or innovation?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting question, because if you go back to what David was talking about initially in the conversation, how the market has changed, when you flip that on the head and start to look at what our customers are saying, what I'm hearing, and this is a bit of a metaphor, but I think it's appropriate, it's a bit of the Wild West. You've got huge growth in this space. You have a lot of different players. You have a lot of different solutions. You have a lot of different capabilities. So you have this supply side of everything that you could do. And at the same time, you have this emergence of all of these problems, not only ATO or account takeover and the growth of synthetic ID, but what I'm also seeing in the space is they have to balance that. Our customers are having to balance that against two other vectors, and that is customer friction. Basically, I want my customer to go through the least number of clicks it has to in order to prove that he or she are who they say they are. Or the second thing is this idea that as they're trying to measure friction, at the same time they're trying to do it at the most cost-effective way that they can in the market, because often the customer journey starts with, let's just say you're on a retail site, it starts with browsing, right? So you don't want to start having to verify somebody as being a fraudster so far up in the funnel that they won't actually go through and put something into their cart. And that's a simple example that we all know, but it's this optimization of friction, of risk combined with cost that really forms the three legs of a stool that I'm hearing our clients talk about all the time. More often than not, I'm hearing, okay, why don't we put our costs exactly where we start to drive revenue? And in this market, that's kind of tough for some of the clients because they're dealing with a lot of legacy technology that's sitting on the shelf that they have to unwind in order to make it easier to use over time.
You know, I wonder too, there's almost a third leg of the balancing act that brings to my head. And so I'm kind of wondering, I'm going to make it a sort of two-part question for both of you that way then. Is regulations another piece that they sort of have to balance? Because I know regulations are constantly evolving and changing, especially in some of the European markets in particular. They're evolving even faster than they are in the US. And is that affecting certain industries? So that's why I'm saying two-part question is regulations the third piece that they have to sort of balance? And then does that affect some industries more than others?
I would say absolutely, no doubt about that. Take a look at online gambling. First of all, you have to make sure that you are of age. And also some of that online gambling requires that you know the location of where the person is located, you know, and doing the gambling. So Doc IDV kind of solutions are very good at being able to make sure that you have good consumers that you're letting into the online gambling experience. And the other area where I'm seeing regulations is around the whole cryptocurrency space. We were talking a lot with financial institutions, and they identified that if you take a look at the disputes or chargebacks associated with using a credit or debit card in order to fund a cryptocurrency account, most of the disputes and chargebacks on those credit debit card purchases are what we call buyer's remorse. So we took a look at the state of cryptocurrency, where the values have dropped by 2/3 over the past 9 months. So people have gotten into the craze, and all of a sudden, when they saw the value of their cryptocurrencies drop, they just called their FI and said, "Oh, that wasn't me. I didn't buy that cryptocurrency." And so regulations are now starting to be used in order to leverage Doc IDV to be able to say, well, no, you actually did do that. You know, that was you who performed the transaction. Or you go back to a federal auditor who comes in order to audit your books to make sure that you are complying with various regulations, again, for, you know, any kind of age or substance purchases, things along those lines, where you have to show proof of identity. Doc IDV is certainly an area where that's being used in order to make sure that you are legitimate, if you will.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Chris, definitely want you to jump in there as well. The one that popped into my head as you were sort of talking about gambling is one of the new emerging ones. So there are a lot of businesses also emerging around, you know, we'll call it package delivery, but the cannabis industry in particular, there are a lot of regulations and changes because it's not legal in every state in the US. There's obviously age restrictions. There's a whole lot of different moving parts and pieces, but a lot of people are trying to get into that business and do deliveries for it. So there's a lot of ways that you sort of have to slice and dice, again, to your point, geolocation, age verification, a whole bunch of other pieces, not just is the person on the other end a real person or a fraudster. But are they of age? Are they the right person? Are they living in a state where they're allowed to get it? So yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic of you know, additional factors that need to be taken into consideration.
You're right, Adam. It's like not only where they are, but where they're procuring a product from. and what regulation applies to what part of that market, right? So you have to consider a lot of what's going on in the market. And the problem is that if you take regulations one step further, data doesn't travel well across international borders, or quite frankly, even in some places, it doesn't travel across state borders that well. There are lots of rules. So if you take CCPA out of California and compare it with some of the other types of digital legislation that you're seeing emerge, particularly in the United States, but you're seeing it all over the place in the EU as well. The question is, what is the lowest, or in many cases, what's the highest common denominator that our customers have to apply to a specific transaction, right?
Yeah.
And then even when you get into specific segments, I love, David, the fact that you chose this sort of age verification, because what we're already starting to see as well is this very interesting stratification where it's not just about gambling off or on, because in general, you could say, okay, let's say you're in a particular jurisdiction, you're allowed to gamble or not. The more interesting ones that are starting to emerge for us are prove that you're 13 so you can order a specific add-in for your Xbox, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are billions of transactions like that are occurring on a daily basis, where you have people that are online just occurring that what we would perceive to be the simplest of transactions, but with those regulatory frameworks. And in many cases, the regulations haven't even been defined. You have to adhere to a certain set of standards that are commonly adopted and held, which creates more of this Wild West for the customers trying to figure out, well, if I'm going to prove that this is the case or not the case, I'm going to take this route versus that route. Another one that I would throw into the mix that we're starting to see, because again, the regulations are changing or government scrutiny is changing, particularly in the United States, is BNPL. So the buy now, pay later market, where you're seeing CFPB coming and applying more and more of a threat across the top of that. But you're also seeing that appear in other markets with other vendors occurring the same way in the UK as well. So there is a lot going on in the space, and a lot of it is not always as simple as the transaction of showing your driver's license so that you can drive. Oh, by the way, that's being complicated by mobile driver's license and regulations around that as well.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot moving in this space right now. Overall, it's super complicated. And I know that with Aite and other types of organizations, that you provide quite a bit of expertise to help clients and customers sort of navigate that landscape. And we often find ourselves as Mitek in similar shoes, spending quite a bit of time exploring those discussions around the business problems as much as talking about identity verification, which is really a relatively straightforward solution if you know what you're going after.
And Adam, I thought it was really interesting, the question around regulatory aspects of this, because I think the government has to kind of eat their own dog food in some respects, from the standpoint that take a look at all the stimulus fraud that occurred in 2020 and 2021 with the efforts in order to be able to get funds into the hands of people as quickly as possible. Unemployment fraud scams, you know, I can't tell you how many billions of dollars were lost associated with that. Deceased individuals who were getting paid for unemployment, and people who were, you know, incarcerated getting paid for it. And so really
in
kind of
some
highlights the fact.
in some cases, I imagine, David, even from jail.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I will tell you, even from a personal level, so it's amazing that you brought that one up. I actually got notified by the state of Texas, I live here in Austin, that I was, you know, I had to fill out a bunch of paperwork to receive my unemployment verification stuff. And I looked at it and I went, I have had a job for like the last 25 years. I'm not really sure why I'm getting this. I had to reach out to the State Department and find out, it's probably just a fraud scam. Somebody's putting your name in and trying to collect on your behalf. But luckily the paperwork came to my home address. But I feel like that's such an archaic way to verify that it's really me, that was a sort of a frightening and eye-awakening experience as well.
And even if you'd filled out the paperwork, it could have just as soon gone to anybody else, and they could have filled it out as you as well. Here, and that goes back to what David was saying before, and that is what's driving this at its most primary base is this trend towards digital, right? If you're going to transact with an individual as a company, as a financial institution, as a center for gambling, and or a hub that's providing a service that needs to be age verified, and you want to do it digitally, it's this preemptiveness around going into the space that's really driving the demand around how people really need to use this more effectively.
Yeah. So I had one additional question that I wanted to ask, but I think I'm going to throw not a haymaker, a wild card at you guys just to ask the question too, because I'm curious as we started to talk about a lot of really re-authentication use cases along the course of the talk track. I think one of the things that's always interesting to me of that verification from a gaming standpoint that you talked about, Chris, of, okay, if I'm a 13-year-old and I'm using my mom's iPhone to play a game, can I do an in-app purchase of certain types of content? Do we have a way to verify that that person is mom or is the child? And by that same token, then if that kid or the husband or someone else has access to that phone, even the biometrics don't necessarily prove that that person is who they are supposed to be on the other end of that transaction, because multiple people have access to that device. So, are there other types of solutions? Are there off-device or third-party biometric plays that really would help verification, be more secure as an authentication method?
Yeah, I think that the whole aspect of re-authentication, it came up in the study that we did last year, because when you take a look at traditional uses of document identification and verification, it really is at the point of account creation.
Right.
So you can actually verify the identity of the person before you open up the account. But what we're finding in the interviews that we did, and we talked to even about 25 clients who have deployed these solutions across a number of different vendors. What we found is that the data that's being collected at the point of account creation through document identification verification solutions, that data is valuable as well in order to be able to do user authentication at account login. So when you think that maybe, again, we're all bad when it comes to usernames and passwords out there. And we've done some studies in terms of how often the same password is used for every account that I have across the entire internet. But when you you get by the username and password, so you're logging in, okay, the location may look a little bit odd, but then as you go through that user journey and all of a sudden the risk of the transaction that's being requested goes up, then you can use this technology to actually authenticate the user again using some of the data that you collected initially at the point of time of account being opened. And so the whole idea of a dual use of this technology, not just for account login, but to prevent account takeover, very beneficial.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that without a doubt that we're seeing in the space as well, we're seeing the advent of biometrics being used at multiple points during a journey. Number one, because it enables us to be able to create sort of a multimodal tie between either that proof of identity and or the biometric, but then that can be replicated because it's been biometrically bound through a process and can then actually be reused. The one or two really drawbacks I think that many of our clients are seeing is that it requires quite a bit of thinking through that strategy. Like you just said, David, at the very beginning, you have to say, hey, if I'm going to capture this information at point A, and my interaction with the consumer says they expect for me to know who I am, I should respect that by creating an architecture, a technology that allows me to be able to train that thread through a series of customer journeys. And whereas I love the tech, and I do really think that it is on the emerging part of this side, many of our clients are having to work through the process of, if I capture it here, can I use it here? If I capture it here, can I use it there? And that seems to be one of the things that's drawing back is a more effective, cohesive strategy around their biometrics generally, or even just their access points more generally beyond that, and how they're using those across the enterprise, particularly if they have multiple silos, different divisions. So like a big bank would have cards, and you'd have auto, and you have checking, and you have all these different groups, and they often aren't talking to one another and possibly aren't even using the same process to be able to identify somebody that's coming in to the four walls, even if it's a current customer.
Okay. Yeah, I had one bank case to take this to another level where a fraud executive starting at a new bank went through and reviewed their existing accounts, the accounts on the books, and estimated that anywhere between 10 to 15% of the accounts were likely related to a synthetic identity. Wow. And so using document identification verification to re-authenticate those accounts that they're suspicious about just to make sure that they are a true live person, who they say they are, or whether it's a fictitious person who was able to get through the initial set of onboarding and KYC kind of controls.
Yeah.
And you can persist that synthetic ID across multiple transactions in that scenario, right?
Yes.
Well, and
exactly.
Too, you talked about KYC processes. That's another one that we see from the PEPs and sanctions standpoint or the watch list standpoint, right? You can check somebody when they get onboarded, but if they start doing fraud later down the line, if all you did was check them at the front door and never checked again, didn't run a re-verification once a year to find out have they been added to these lists, you're really not doing your job on that true KYC process. So yeah, it is one of those things where it's continuous throughout the life cycle of the relationship. So one last question with our kind of remaining time that I wanted to make sure I got on the docket for both of you. So I'm going to ask you guys to sort of look into your crystal balls and maybe just give your thoughts on what the future of both identity documents are, but identity verification in general as well. Like, what are those going to look like 5-10 years from now?
Oh, that's always a fun time, to look at that crystal ball and see what's going on there. But we saw some interesting technology coming out. The days of taking selfies are probably going to be gone. What I see replacing that is short video bursts. And the nice thing about that is you can analyze those short video bursts to identify that one frame that has the best picture quality of the individual in order to be able to capture that picture rather than the user actually having to click a button on their phone and actually to capture the image itself. The other thing that allows you to do is you can do contextual awareness. So if you're saying that you're applying from a residential address, but yet it looks like in the background you're sitting in a warehouse, okay, the flags go up. Or if by chance you are sitting at a desk and you have 100 driver's licenses sitting right next to you as well, that looks a little bit odd. So the whole contextual awareness through short video bursts, I think is something that we're going to be seeing more and more of. You talk about digital documents coming out, digital driver's licenses. That's going to be an interesting world that we all get into. I think a few states have started to broach that, but as that starts gaining traction in the United States and gaining more popularity, how do we handle that is going to be really interesting, and how those documents issued in the first place. And the last thing I think interesting is those documents that have EMV chip cards on them. Just like our debit and credit cards have chip cards, you can have documents that have chip cards. And so not only do you have data that is printed on the document, but you also have data that's encoded in the chip. And so you can do multiple levels of authentication and verification of the data through some of those mechanisms.
Yeah, those are really good ones. NFC chip, near field chip in particular, is one of the ones that is gaining traction very, very quickly already.
Exactly. And we do see that with a lot of our clients. And one of the interesting verification components that we'll see is that clients will compare the values that are on the chip to the values that are on the document. They'll look at biodata on the document compared to biodata on the chip. And in the case where they're actually capturing information, either video or face, they can actually do compares against that in real time to both enhance the corroboration across the different vectors of the specific identity document itself, but also to make sure that it does match to something that's live. I think in addition to that, what you will see is more and more standards start to emerge around how those types of documents can be used, or quite frankly, not used, in what types of scenarios. That's going to cause a bit of friction. And then, as you mentioned, I see a world where there's actually no physical plastic, but that's probably 20 years off into the future, because we are talking about always operating sort of at the lowest common denominator. But some of our clients have already said that they're seeing people show up at rental counters asking for to the ability to be able to use a digital passport or a digital identity to be able to perform a transaction. Yeah. So it will become a world where you have to operate in a bit of a hybrid state until then, again, increasing complexity for many customers to be able to manage both of those types of transactions. And back to your point that you were making, David, ensure in fact that both are legitimate. You have to ensure that a physical card is legitimate, and you have to ensure that a digital ID is legitimate. And how those are actually verified are very different processes across the board. So there's not only this technology trend that we're going to see over time that's going to focus on things like liveness, that's going to focus on some specific problems that we're seeing like injection replay, but also starting to expand into the complexity of how we create these hybrid methods by which we identify people, which often include the introduction of, David, you made a reference to this, third-party signals. You know, I want to geolocate. Do you give me authorization to geolocate you to a 10-meter reference point? And if so, and I know that's your house, and I know that you're executing an online transaction to be able to buy something from a specific retailer, the likelihood that this is fraud is lower. And then that can be factored in. Again, you have cost plays, so the cost competition for this data is going to become enormously competitive in the space, I would argue as well.
And talking about external data, the other thing that I see is these solutions integrating with third-party data repositories, such as credit bureaus, so that when you take a look at all the PII data that's collected on the document itself, driver's license, passport, otherwise, maybe even embedded within the chip that's on the document, that you can then bounce that information off of a credit bureau to ask the question, is this a real person? Yeah. Does this name and address and social and whatever else, does it all match or not? And so using some of these third-party repositories, and there are different sources of these in different countries depending on where you're operating in, but being able to just match that information is no longer good enough to take a look at the data on the barcode and the data printed on the card to see if they match. You now have to go to outside data sources in order to compare that as well, just to make sure that it does correspond to a real person, just because of the way that the fraudsters have gotten so good at creating some of these fakes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really key point to, sort of the movement that we're seeing towards true identity platforms, the ability to bring in signals from a lot of different places, because you need multiple signals just to really corroborate that identity. And then to your point, depending on the geography that you're operating in, it may be a signal that you need to get from a particular bureau in one country and a completely different place in a different country. So that is key. Well, with that, I think that's probably a reasonable note to close out the conversation on. I really appreciate you both sort of taking the time to share your thoughts and expertise today, and hope we get to have a chance to talk again.
Fantastic.
Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Adam.
Thank you all. Take care.